this is based on some research they've been doing for a while, and some very interesting stuff. So, and I'm sure we'll have questions as we get to the end and stuff, and then we'll look at some of the pieces. Thank you guys for coming tonight, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you.
So Alex and I are going to kind of take turns shuffling back and forth, so bear with us as we transition. We are going to start by sort of setting the stage with sort of a narrative that we're going to kind of come back throughout to try and put all these pieces together. And this is the story of Prince Hal, who was shot in the face with an arrow at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. This is a description of the event from First English Life of Henry V, written in 1438. And I'll go ahead and just like read that because not everybody can see it necessarily. Keeping in mind here that this is well after the event. This was text by an anonymous author that was meant to gain attention, and it was dedicated to the royal family. So this is Prince Hal shot in the face with an arrow. The courage and strength of the young Prince Henry appeared marvelously excellent, for in the same battle as he with a fervent mind fought, peradventure unwarily, among the rebels, he was wounded in the face with an arrow so sore that they that were present with him were in despair of his life. Wherefore they pained him to withdraw him from the battle. But that noble prince, perceiving their intent, gave to them this answer. With what stomach, said he, shall our people fight when they see me, their prince and the king's son, withdraw myself and recoil for fear? Bring me, therefore, wounded as I am, amongst the first and the foremost of our party, that not only by words, but also by deeds, I may enforce the courage of our men, as it becometh a prince for to do. That when he was thus brought into the front of the battle, he made upon his enemies a greater assault than before. Now, here we have this image of Henry shot in the face with an arrow. Valiantly take me to the front lines, let them see the streaming blood from my body, and this will rally the troops. The surgical record of John Bradmore, who was the surgeon who eventually removed the arrow, says that it was in a depth. Actually, could you, I'm going to come back to this slide. So go ahead and go to the next one. Yeah. So John Bradmore is the surgeon who eventually removed the arrowhead that was left inside of the wound and successfully treated the prince, obviously went on to wage more war. And this is his description. And it should be known that in the year of our Lord 1403, the 4th year of the reign of the most illustrious King Henry, the 4th after the conquest, on the vigil of St. Mary Magdalene, it happened that the son and heir of the aforesaid illustrious king, the Prince of Wales and Duke of Aquitaine and Lancaster, was struck by an arrow next to his nose on the left side during the battle at Shrewsbury, the which arrow entered at an angle extraverso, and after the arrow shaft was extracted, the head of the aforesaid arrow remained in the furthermost part of the bone of the skull for the depth of 6 inches. So probably not running around in front of people with an arrow stuck 6 inches inside of his face. So if we go back, this is from Gray's Anatomy, but shows where most likely scholars think that this arrow entered. And so the infraorbital foramen is what's highlighted there and is like the red dot. So right next to the left side of his nose would have penetrated to a depth roughly of 6 inches, lodging in the back of the skull. Very luckily, missing the majority of the brain. Lots of people speculate, if you've read the Shakespearean plays, the Henriade, his behavior changes significantly from being a riotous prince to a very serious king. And so there's lots of people who conjecture maybe there was some kind of brain damage that caused a change in personality. Whatever that was, we don't know, but we do know and have the surgical case study that was documented by John Bradmore to sort of give us insight into what the body of a wounded soldier, how that kind of treatment procedure went in a very miraculous intervention. The surgeon was able to remove the arrowhead, treat the patient in a very detailed, painful way we'll tell you about over the course of 20 days so that he made a recovery. And one of the things that we want to come back to is the idea of what the wounded body does, what it means on the battlefield, that it can be simultaneously a rallying cry, as it is presented in the first quotation that I read, but also as something that obviously carries with the scars and with the trauma of the wounding process and the healing process that comes with its own, as we would call it today, post-traumatic stress disorder for the person who was involved in battle. So we want to kind of think about what it means to be simultaneously a respectable, admirable, valiant, brave figure who also is marked by this kind of trauma. So I don't want to take up too much time with the story of Prince Hal. We're going to kind of come back to it. A couple of things about the arrow. The Battle of Shrewsbury was famously one of the first battle where English longbow forces fought other English longbow forces, and there were lots of people, actually like Henry Percy, who was leading the other side, the rebels. He was probably shot also in the face with an arrow, but he died. So arrows and faces all over the place. There's lots of speculation about how an arrow might have gotten inside the face of our young prince. One of the common theories is that he lifted his visor and was looking up. So keep your visors down should you not want arrows in your face. But you can afterwards handle this, can move it around, see sort of the ways that it would, oftentimes we'll talk more about this, lots of head wounds, and obviously people had helmets, so what were they doing with them? So we'll kind of like touch on those themes throughout too. So just wanted to give a little context with this story of Prince Hal that we'll be returning to as an overview of sort of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about the development of surgical practice and the rise of sort of surgical expertise in relation to battlefield wounds. This is a great example of one of the ways that innovatively surgeons would take the trauma that they were faced with and try and come up with it. So the arrowhead, it's called an arrow in the Latin sagitta, which is what John Bradmore recorded his case study in, which is often translated as arrow. But the arrowhead itself, at least the English translation in 1446, is called a bod. So probably a bodkin point. This would have not been like a broad head. We've got some examples up here that you can see afterward. And here's one I can pick up and not risk, if I drop it, it's fine. That these were designed to come off inside of the body. They wanted them left in there. It's obviously an infection risk or damage when you try and pull it out. So they probably on the battlefield yanked the arrow out of Prince Hal's head, leaving behind the arrowhead. Lots of people tried to get it out and couldn't, until finally John Bradmore came along and had this tool designed to go inside of the wound tract and have that part fitted into where the underside of the arrowhead so that it could be expanded and then he could retract it. So Alex is going to talk about some of the other sorts of tools that would be coming up for treating wounds and what you did with them. And then I'm going to talk kind of about my specialty, which is gender, and what were women doing on the battlefield, what were their women surgeons, what were they talking about, and pair that with some literary examples. Then back to Alex, where we're going to talk about sort of what we do with archaeological remains. So I'm going to switch places.
So a few of the tools that would have been used by late medieval and Renaissance era surgeons are very well encapsulated by the history of the wound man image, which a few of you might have noticed we talked about a couple of months ago on the Oakeshott website. But what exactly are the wound men? So these are the sorts of images that a medieval surgeon would generally use primarily as a reference material. It's the sort of thing that would show up in a number of late medieval surgery manuals. For example, one area of my personal research is Hans von Gerstorff's field book of worthy wound treatment from the early 16th century. There's also the very famous example of the pseudo-Galen, essentially a medieval scholar with some learning who wanted to compare himself to the great physician of the ancient world, Galen, calling himself Galen in the text, producing the wound man image. But what exactly is this used for? And is there any use for it in the context of a battlefield, or is it largely academic? The answer is really a combination of different responses depending on the circumstances, in that these represent both the practical and diagrammatic aspect of wound treatment in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, but they're also works of visual art. They are supposed to be emblematic as much as they are meant to be instructive. So the idea of having an individual, for example, in the Gerstorff pose, who is pierced, sliced, slashed, bedeviled, beboiled, in every imaginable context of injury, is meant to represent any type of wound that a surgeon on a battlefield in a martial context should be capable of treating. But you also have an individual who is in a classical pose, in a classical agrarian environment, meant to represent aspects of the universality of the human body and the idea of how a physician regardless of levels of training, as we'll talk about more later, should have a broad awareness of treating the human body. You have the evolution of tropes of this. A lot of what we see on the left side here is more moving into what is often considered the beginning of the scientific revolution in anatomy. These are plates from Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or On the Fabric of the Human Body. They're often considered the first real-to-life representations of human anatomy, but they are not coming out of nowhere. I mean, despite the idea of thinking about there is a flash with the Renaissance and the beginning of the scientific revolution, and everyone is suddenly better aware of how to interact with the natural world, really it's an evolution from earlier models of dealing with keeping a body healthy, keeping it intact, and even keeping the sense of philosophical whimsy, in the sense of, yeah, it's really useful to know about the bone structure of the human body, but memento mori, also very important. Can the skeleton contemplate its own existence? And in many ways, you can see the evolution of the wound band itself about practical wound treatment. These are showing up as late as the late 17th and early 18th century in terms of their actual representation. And you can also note some history of the types of wounds that a person might expect to face by the late 17th century as compared to 150 years earlier. I mean, no less gruesome, but fewer examples of things. But what are some of the practical elements of medieval surgery, wound treatment? The medieval surgeon himself, or herself actually, could have been a wide variety of, coming from a wide variety of different professional backgrounds. Many of them would have been individuals who would have of apprentice-based training. Usually these would be the sort of individuals who worked as barber surgeons. Oftentimes they would be employed seasonally by city governments to work as the physician for the local militias, as was the case with Hans von Gersdorff. Sometimes they came at it with some degree of university-based training, which also incorporated a lot of medical theory. And sometimes it was just, are you handy with a knife? Are you handy with the tool set? Can you set a bone? Can you hold someone down and saw off a limb? Can you clean a wound and not faint from, you know, the blood-curdling screams of your patients? But examples of the types of wounds that would have been very common by the battlefields of Henry V or the late medieval world are exemplified here in Gersdorff when he talks about, for example, the three main types of shot that would be threatening to the individual on the late medieval battlefield, whether it be from the crossbow, whether it be from the longbow, or increasingly common gunpowder weapons. And the basic methodology is relatively similar. You usually have to find a way to remove the offending object. You then usually have to find a way to disinfect as much as you can the wound itself. They wouldn't have thought about it in bacteriology terms necessarily, but the idea of festering flesh was something that goes all the way back to the ancient world. Most of the treatments would have involved, say, pouring in wine or honey as a major form of disinfectant. And then also the question, which we can spend more time on later if anyone's really interested, the philosophical arguments of whether or not you leave the wound open or you allow it to be covered with bandages. We also have examples of the variety of different kinds of treatment, from traumatic to everyday levels of treatment that a battlefield surgeon would have to be exposed to. For example, the idea of amputation is not unfamiliar to anyone who has a sense of military history. But the variety of technology that most battlefield surgeons, even those without university-based education, is represented again by the image you see in the middle from Gersdorff. The variety of instruments that would be necessary, all for very specific purposes. You saw earlier the instrument developed by John Bradmore, which was a combination of enlarging tongs and a screw running down the middle, which he used to remove the arrow from the face of Prince Hal. But you also would have had much more common implements like the cauterizing iron, which becomes very important, especially after the development of gunpowder weapons. Usually there was the desire of staunching blood flow, cleaning off flesh, especially flesh that's been recently amputated around limbs, would generally be responded to with cauterizing iron. You also have perhaps unexpected examples of consideration for the patient. So as we're thinking about how exactly we historicize the figures we're talking about, something that we'd like you to keep in mind is the idea of the brutality of medieval and early modern warfare, because there's often this conception that you're flipping a coin on whether or not you're going to live and die. It's this brutal sense of most people, if you're wounded in the pre-modern world, in the pre-antibiotics world, you're basically dead anyway. And this is something that a lot of historians of medicine and historians of the medieval world have been pushing back against recently. The idea that, no, you actually do have a lot of skilled individuals in the pre-modern world, in the, you could say, pre-scientific world, who are quite effective at treating patients and even have a certain consideration for them you might not expect. For example, this other example from Gersdorff regards trepanation. So if, for example, you have been wounded in the head, say you have taken the end of a pole axe to your helm, and the helm has started to cave in, perhaps also caving in large portions of the cranium, there is going to be a necessary removal of pressure from the head itself. And this is often performed by trepanation, so it's clearing away bits of the fragmented skull, it's clearing away distressed bits of the dura mater between the skull and the brain. And I love this image in particular, and the translation is from the one on the left side. The idea of drilling into the skull of his patient says, this instrument is for the removal of damaged dura mater both deep within near the surface of the skull. Now, you should place rags beneath the feet for the comfort of the patient, keeping the pointed screw, sharp as it here appears, directly amidst the matter. You want to have warm towels placed underneath the cold metal for the comfort of the patient with the drill in his head. The idea of triage is not something we necessarily think a lot about in terms of how people on the battlefield are being taken care of. And yet there is the example with Hal himself in terms of the process of a very specific historical example. This is from the Philomena again, the account by John Bradmore, where he talks about, and after the wound was so enlarged and deep enough that by my reckoning the probes reached the bottom of the wound, I prepared anew some little tongs, small and hollow, and with the width of an arrow. A screw ran through the middle of these tongs, whose ends were well rounded both on the inside and outside, and even the end of the screw, which entered into the middle, was well rounded over all in the way of a screw, so that it should grip better and more strongly. This is its form. I put these tongs at an angle in the same way as the arrow first entered, and then placed the screw in the center. Finally, the tongs entered the socket of the arrowhead, and then moving it to and fro, the device in his head, little by little, with the help of God, I extracted the arrowhead. It also took about 16 hours overall for the removal. Little by little, Hal is going likely in and out of consciousness for a lot of this. Brief, there's no real mention of painkillers either for this. But the idea of thinking about the wounded body of the individual and the treater of the wounded body is something that
is often overlooked when we think about the representation of violence in a pre-modern context. So part of what we'd like you to consider here tonight is not only how the wounds are being affected, but how are they being treated.
Who is doing the treating? And then in the same context as we think about the martial world of today, how do people go on afterwards? What is the idea of the wounded body post-battlefield? And for that, I'm going to hand it back over to Amanda to talk more about specific medieval surgeons.
So the people you are seeing now are considered some of the greatest surgeons of the pre-modern world and the ancient world. Hippocrates, of course, we're pretty well familiar with from the Hippocratic Oath. All of these surgeons were huge advocates of surgery. In today's medical practice, usually if you think of the status of surgeons and doctors, surgeons are at the top, especially if you've got neurosurgeons. They make the most money, they go to school a really long time, and they, status-wise, are towards the top. That is not the case in the period of time that we're talking about. And so I'm going to kind of talk about class a little bit and complicate that in relation to gender. But I want to start by kind of getting a sense of who some of the major players are. These are all examples of to some degree, more or less, they're all learned surgeons. So as Alex mentioned, a lot of surgeons, they would learn their skill through apprentice programs. Some of them would go to university, some of them wouldn't. Some of them were learned, we know, because they were literate, they left written texts. John Bradmore certainly had some level of probably formal education, since he left his case record in Latin as opposed to the vernacular. Ambrose Paré, who is the most prolific of the surgeons that we talk about, sort of known as kind of the father of modern surgery. He wrote exclusively in French, and it was wildly popular, quickly translated into many of the European languages. He came up with many innovative approaches to treating the new kinds of wounds that were seen on the late medieval and early modern battlefields from gunshot. And so one time, you would treat gunshot wounds with boiling oil, because the predominant theory was that they were poisoned, and so all of the tissue around the gunshot wound would similarly be poisoned, so you would need to kill it and then give chance for new tissue to form. So they would dump really hot boiling oil into your gunshot wound, which I'm sure felt great, and then they would usually, this is kind of the dispute about how you bandage it, oftentimes put some caustic stuff that would actually not have had a great reaction. Well, Ambrose Paré ran out of boiling oil one battle, and so he was like, well, I've got some wine and some honey and some other stuff, so he made that and put it over there and then just covered it with a simple bandage and left it alone. And lo and behold, the next few days, those patients, not only does he say he describes their affective reactions, that they are happier and they feel better, but their wounds recovered more quickly. So certainly not understanding why exactly, but seeing through practice that this works better. So he became a huge advocate for the use of that, and it spread through a lot of surgeons because he was very popular and well known. He also went to all kinds of different sources of information. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but he says that one of his best treatments for gunshot wounds he got from an old lady, because he'd heard that there was an old woman who used to treat a bunch of people that were hurt in battle, and she had this method of doing it, and it worked really well. So he went and found her and got her recipe, essentially, and then that's what he used, and he advocated for basically what works. Use that, even if it doesn't necessarily match 100% with the medical theory that's being taught in the university. If you observe results that are beneficial for the patient, you should do that. So you kind of have this spectrum that goes from Hippocrates, who is basically known for it in the Hippocratic Oath, right? Like, do no harm. That the focus on the patient is very different than the kind of medical theory, like the university academy that you would get if you were going to be a physician. So in terms of medieval and early modern society, the class status, it's the university educated physician that is much higher status and higher ranking. There's a lot of scorn for any of your regular practitioners, particularly for surgeons who are hand workers. Chirurgia is, well, I speak Italian, so I always make Latin sound Italian, but it means of the hand. So they're hand workers. They're working with their hands on the body, and surgery is limited to this surface of the body, which is not how we necessarily think of surgery, right? You're going inside of the body. But the theory of medicine dictated that physicians worked inside the body with medications and understanding why your humors were off and what made it wrong. So all of these examples are people who advocated surgery, and also, this is why I selected them, were either battlefield surgeons or worked with soldiers and advocated for making sure that you go to battle with surgeons, perhaps likely because of his experience in 1403. Prince Henry, when he became king, when he went to Agincourt, took a lot of surgeons with him, probably because he had firsthand seen the benefit of having them on hand. So there are lots of surgeons that are connected to battlefields. That's a relationship that obviously continues on modern battlefields. Lots of our advances, like antiseptic from Lister, comes from battlefield settings and seeing what's happening. So these are sort of the big celebrated figures. All of these are men, which is what we stereotypically think of not only on the battlefield. We don't think of women as being on battlefields. We don't think of women fighting with women belong in the domestic sphere. Sort of our traditional norms that are even stereotypical present in our modern society, we think of as even more in place in the medieval and the early modern world. And to some extent that is true, but there are also lots and lots and lots of exceptions. And that's kind of one of the things I want to focus on next, which is women and surgical practice. Next slide. These are funny sketches from late 1695 showing women surgeons in practice. So here you get some bloodletting, and you get some treating of probably some kind of a surface wound. Actually, that one I think is setting a bone, and this one is bloodletting. And these are comedic, and I picked them on purpose because they're obviously also meant to make fun. There's scorn certainly involved here. And there was a lot of that kind of attitude, not just towards female practitioners, but towards regular practitioners, empirics, people who didn't go to university or necessarily maybe weren't literate, weren't coming into the medical practice in the same way as the university-educated physicians were. But these women we see here, this is from 1695. In 1421, a church edict banned women from practicing medicine or surgery. So a lot of times it's easy to look at these pronouncements and say, oh, well, that means that nobody was doing it. On the contrary, it means lots of people oftentimes were doing it. They didn't like it, tried to stop it, and then we find over and over the next few centuries, lots of cases of women being fined for practicing without license, or women being licensed, particularly in what is now Italy, in Florence and in Naples. Women were licensed as both physicians and surgeons. So you have a lot of women who are doing work that we don't necessarily think of. And so it's only been recently that historiography has sort of started finding these women surgeonesses in the records. And there are lots of them, it turns out. And that makes sense if you think about where most people are getting their treatment. It's at home. And so one of the expectations of a good wife, of a good woman, is that she can treat her family members. And particularly for a gentlewoman, that extends to all the people that are on that land that the area is responsible to. So gentlewomen in particular, you'll find recipe books that are full of medical recipes, and sometimes of like accounts of them setting little Jimmy's leg, because that was one of the responsibilities that was pretty common. So besides, you have these licensing. What Margaret Pelling is a historian who found 110 female practitioners, including lots of surgeons, around London between 1550 and 1640, that the London College of Physicians went after to try and get them to stop, because they were making a lot of money, because they were more effective probably than the local College of London physicians and surgeons, and so they were trying to get the city to shut them down. And there are some records from these texts from the proceedings, essentially, and there's a lot of sassy ladies in there. I would just, they're great fun to read. They're like, well, my method works, so I'm not stopping, I'll just go over here, which was often a pretty common strategy, just relocate. So I kind of talked a little bit about surgery and class status, and how oftentimes, because surgeons tended to be from lower classes, there was less status. They oftentimes were also barbers or gelders, and these are the ones who would go with your giant battlefields that are increasingly common into the 16th and 17th century. The Battle of Shrewsbury, we don't know exactly how many, but good estimates are that there were about 14,000 rebel forces, and there were more with the King Henry IV. So you're talking a lot of people in one place, huge camps. Those camps tended to have a lot of women who were there. Not only, oftentimes wives would go along and keep the camp in order and provide all kinds of services that were necessary, cleaning clothes, mending armor, cleaning weapons, doing all of the things that kept the armies going. So not only were women there on the battlefield, but there were lots of women who would go. And we also have lots of records of women who, and this was common practice, you would take over for your husband if you were in a guild and he died, and you would take over his practice. So we have quite a few examples of women surgeons who took over and ran their husband's practice after they died, because it was really common. You find that, and this makes sense, right, that if you're the daughter of a surgeon, you probably grew up learning how to do a lot of things. You probably marry a surgeon or somebody in an adjacent career path, which means you're taking a lot of valuable skills with you. And particularly in contexts in Italy, and I think the Low Countries, Italy and England are more my area, we have lots of documentation of this kind of family exchange of knowledge, that it's not just about, oh, my daughter marries this person, I have this much dowry, but it's how much information can I get about your craft to bring here, and which crafts go together. And so, female surgeons were pretty common in that context. What did the men think? Well, Guy de Chauliac, Roger Bacon, John of Ardenne, these are all other examples of more learned, because they left us records, late medieval, early modern practitioners who were really critical of women in particular, but lots of unlearned practitioners. Guy de Chauliac considered women and many fools as the lowest engaged in surgical practice in his text, Chirurgia Magna. He really didn't like women practitioners. I'm guessing he probably didn't like the competition. John of Mirfield, who died in 1407, this is a great quotation. He denounced all non-university trained physicians and practitioners, but said women were the worst of the bunch. At the present time, not only ignorant men, but what is worse and must be judged yet more horrible, vile and presumptuous women usurp that office to themselves and abuse it, since they have neither learning nor skill. So, they were pretty thrilled. But on the other hand, you have people like Paret, who not only records when he gets different kinds of recipes and treatments from women, but he advocated for the training of women to be both physicians and surgeons, and worked to, especially for midwifery, to incorporate practice in France for the recognition of that status. Talked a little bit about women on the battlefields. They were in the camps, but also civil hospitals tended to be common places where you would go after you were wounded. So in France, you had Hôtel Dieu. In Paris, throughout the Low Countries, there are several examples too. And every one of these hospitals have sisters attached to them, whether they're secular or not. And those are all women who live there, work there, and they're not only like changing bedding and all that stuff, they're providing the care. They're working hand in hand with sometimes surgeons who would come and consult and do procedures, but they would also be doing all of that work themselves. The Hospitallers had a women's branch. There were quite a few of these different groups that had women's orders that would go to the battlefields and provide treatment and be there. Because if we think about the years from 1500 to 1700, about 95% of them, someplace in Europe, were spent at war. So there's a lot of trauma to go around. And then anybody who can provide thinking about the patient now, who can help somebody feel better, oftentimes is recruited into doing so. So next slide. I'm going to talk just really quickly about two examples from the Faerie Queene. This is the main English text that I work on. The first three books were published in 1590 and the rest of them in 1596. And there's a really common trope in medieval romance literature, and we see it in like the versions of Arthurian stories and stuff that become movies today, of the woman who takes care of the wounded knight. And this is one such example. And this one, Arthur, who is the Arthur you're thinking of, he is like the best.
Knight, and he's wandering around.
He gets he's in a battle with this guy named Malagant. It's the end of the second book, and he almost loses. So that was bad for him. And he tries to get up on his horse, and he's bleeding so much, and he like falls off. And he this is how this text describes his state. His feeble veins him failed thereto, and served not his need. Through loss of blood, which from his wounds did bleed, that he began to faint, and life decay. So they go back to the nearby castle, which is Alma's, and Alma tends him. She takes care of him. With balm and wine and costly spicery, to comfort him in his infirmity. As soon she caused him up to be conveyed, and of his arms despoiled easily, in sumptuous bed she made him to be laid, and all the while his wounds were dressing, by him stayed. So the description we get here is, fairly stereotypical, but it's also instructive into what Alma knew how to do, which not only does she know, like, you remove constricting clothing, right, so you can access where the wounds are and you treat them. She uses common medical interventions, wine and herbs, and tinctures with spices. She uses different kinds of wound dressing practices to counteract the initial blood loss and the resulting weakness. And the text interestingly used the words despoiled, which means not only to take off, but it's also a really common term, and the word spoils comes from it, the removal of something in a exchange of combat, right? Like the victor gets the spoils, rather. And the sense of the word was very much present in 16th century English. So the usage of this word comes with it the valence, not only that she is in treating him, taking the place of victor, which he just was barely in the recent combat, that his return to health is due to her intervention. But similarly, there's an interesting gender dynamic here with a woman healer who is not only taking off the armor, the representation of his status and his protection of Arthur, but also that she is doing so in her own house. This is in her territory, her controlled castle. And so we get this really interesting inflection to think about what it does and how problematic it is to have a power dynamic between the person being treated and the person who's providing the care, whether that be a woman or think again what we're talking about with how most of these surgeons come from lower classes. They might be gelders and barbers in their spare time, that you have a lot of complication of the power relations that are expected in a very hierarchical society. Next one. This next example is really similar, and I find this image hilarious to me because it's from an illustrated version of the Faerie Queene for children from about 1910. And it says, a wood nymph discovers the wounded Timaeus. Timaeus is the squire of Arthur. The wood nymph is Belphoebe. It's actually like described the whole text. She is like the daughter essentially of Diana, not literally, but that's her representation. She lives in the forest. She is like an Amazon. And so she's not a wood nymph by any means, and she is a skilled hunter. So the way that the text needs to sort of position her and its representation is really interesting, considering how the text describes their interaction. So Timaeus has just fought this battle, and he gets hurt. He's bleeding all over the place. So in comes Belphoebe. It describes him again losing blood, for of that cruel wound he bled so sore that from his steed he fell in deadly swoon, yet still the blood forth gushed in so great store that he lay wallowed all in his own gore. This is where Belphoebe comes in, and she describes what she does. Again, it's very common of medical practice. She, quote, rubbed his temples and each trembling vein, his mailed habericon she did undite, and from his head his heavy burgonet, that's an armet, but similar, did light. These are medical ways of learning what's going on with the body. Her rubbing his veins and his temples is just like percussion and auscultation. It helps to identify where the problems are and exactly what's going on. She, like Alma, removes the armor to be able to fully examine his condition. And she treats him similarly. She gathers herbs to produce a juice and puts on the wound. The flesh therewith she suppled and did steep to abate all spasm, and soak the swelling bruise, and after having searched the entoos deep, she with her scarf did bind the wound from cold to keep. Now, keep in mind the John Bradmore story, right? About him probing the wound, figuring out exactly what's going on inside. We're gonna show a slide a little bit later. He similarly is really concerned about spasms, because seizure would be, and spasming is a physiological response to trauma. So she's concerned with the same kind of things a surgeon is. She is suppling the wound, which is another practice of basically being able to remove damaged tissue and being able to search it and understand exactly what needs to be removed, if anything does, providing a treatment, and then binding the wound. So Timaeus goes on to heal well, although he falls in love hopelessly, and she doesn't love him back, so that's very tragic for him. It's very sad. But this kind of, all of these things want to bring the pieces together and go back to the story of Prince Hal and John Bradmore and think about that power dynamic, right? You are the crown prince. The surgeon he's pretty good, but he's not their first choice. In fact, they went to several other people before they brought in John Bradmore. So how attentive you had to be to not only what you were doing, but also the implications of what failure could look like when failure was pretty common because of, obviously, the lack of knowledge about infection in particular. So we're going to talk now more about forensic pathology and what kinds of information we get from battlefields and how we kind of interpret it rightfully or wrongly from a few of the different most famous battles. And I'll turn that over to Alex.
So as I'm getting mic'd up, what you're seeing here are, and what you will see are a few examples from the early 20th century excavations of the battlefield of Wisby in Sweden. This is one of the most notable medieval battle sites, in particular because of the wealth of human remains that we are able to study. And it raises the question of, when we're discussing the wounded body, the wounded pre-modern body, we have to consider the architects of treatments, the physicians, the surgeons, but also the body itself. And how do you begin to analyze and interpret any sort of damaged body in a martial context? So maybe we can go briefly through just a few of these examples to show the types of remains that would have been encountered early on. A number of these are from mass graves that are laid out in a horseshoe pattern around a local chapel from afterwards in the battle. And this one maybe we can pause on because it's representative of a number of different questions that anyone working in the study of the wounding, illness, and or treatment of damaged bodies, known as paleopathology, when you're talking about individuals that are long dead. And the question of how can you at all determine any method of medical damage or medical treatment in a pre-modern context when you don't have an actual living body in front of you to question or to observe in terms of having most of your fleshy material still intact. Most of paleopathology is relegated
to skeletal work, because again, for the most part,
it's all that really remains of human work. But it brings up a number of questions relevant especially to the martial context of when we see any number of weapons, when we who practice recreative medieval martial arts talk about things like blade alignment or proper force or even the processing of guards or minor wounds that most of us have gotten at points, usually on our hands. How can we begin to interpret the lethality, the violence of these in respect with pre-modern bodies? So you can see in the back of the skull of this particular example from Wisby, there is a relatively squarish hole just on the back of the cranium. And this is likely the result of a square-ended spike, like you would find at the end of a warhammer, usually something that would have been flailed from horseback against a number of, well, mostly peasants in the example of Wisby. Wisby is interesting in part because it also has a differentiation of wound types between bodies dependent on the relative social status of the presumed wounded individuals as well. So frequently you would find examples of square poked holes, oftentimes through helms of bodies like this, through mail, through helmets. And these would be the sorts of wounds that someone like Perret or Gersdorff or de Mondeville would be very familiar with as they write about, okay, how do you perform trepanation? How do you perform the removal of dura mater? You'll also find a number of examples from the less well-armored bodies, the less well-dressed, or oftentimes the bodies with more individual signifiers of, say, early onset bone decay, indicating they were likely coming from a less privileged background. A number of these bodies possessing wounds that are many head wounds similar to this, but also a number of lacerations across the hands and forearms. In fact, the majority of late medieval blade wounds don't come to the torso. They don't come to the head very frequently because these are the best armored parts of most individuals on the battlefield, even if you just have a jack, like a heavy leather jacket.
You are less likely to be wounded by a blade than by a polearm in the medieval
and early modern context. However, the idea of, say, backing away from a man on horseback or a fully armored knight and using your arms as last mode of defense is much more common among a number of these bodies. We also have examples of this in one of the other best documented archaeological sites for medieval warfare, the Battle of Towton Moor, from the very mid 15th century, the Battle of Towton Moor, which offer a number of examples similar to the Wisby battlefield in terms of self-defense laceration wounds. Also, a number of examples of similar square punched holes. The example of the polearm that we see here, which is something that we won't encourage you to swing around necessarily, but you can handle it a little more robustly because this is a recreative piece by the arms and armor folks. Show examples of the kinds of wounds that would have been commonplace. And it raises the question of, when we are encountering wounded bodies, is there an appropriate way to engage with trying to determine what exactly a wounded body looks like, what exactly treatment is like, and then what are the consequences in the post-battlefield context of things like post-traumatic stress, the social representations of wounding. And we have just a number of questions that any historian who is interested in answering these questions has to go through. Frequently, you'll see examples of recreative aspects of martial combat. It's very popular in sort of that History Channel-esque type of representation. Although there was one recently done by Toby Capwell of The Wallace regarding a longbow, which a number of you might have seen, which was actually pretty good overall in terms of its methodology. But whenever you're testing these methods, whenever you're trying to get into an area of physical replicability to determine how bad is a wound actually going to be, you have to think about a wide variety of representations. So do you have a textual record, or are you only working with a body? If you have a textual record like John Bradmore's account, how do you begin to interpret the various methods of treatment? How do you begin to interpret the use of particular methods of language, jargon? If you have just the body alone, you have to consider everything from the basic force of a sword swing or an arrow to the face. What exactly can you do to replicate velocity, angle, the skill of the archer in many of these cases in terms of actually being able to deliberately aim for these places? Or is that relevant? It depends on the interpretation. You also need to think about the ethical considerations of recreative work. For example, I've been looking more and more recently at a project which might see the sign of the internet at some point regarding the testing of shooting pigs with crossbows. These are undrained pigs because the bleeding is actually very important to the experiment. But what exactly are the ethics of recreating any number of these experiments themselves, even if it's just facsimiles? And ideally, you'll actually be seeing more of this when we test medieval clothing coming up in the next year or so. So keep an eye on the Oakeshott website for that. But we also have this question of then how do you interpret the medieval, the pre-modern body in terms of thinking about cultures of violence, of thinking about how people are coming away from the battlefield, and then also how is it represented in the popular culture, sort of the strongest historical voices that we might be familiar with. So these are examples from Shakespeare's Henry V. Most of these coming from, I think they're both from right after the onslaught of the Battle of Agincourt, which of course the English win. And you have here King Henry offering, many of our bodies shall no doubt find native graves, upon the which I trust shall witness live in brass of this day's work, and those that leave their valiant bones in France, dying like though buried in your dunghills, they shall be famed. So this is Henry as he's responding to the French herald who keeps coming back and saying, you sure you don't want to surrender? You sure you don't want to take the opportunity to surrender now? We outnumber you substantially. But he says, no, we are, and playing on the idea of the yeomanry, the valiant workaday soldier, I think is the phrase he uses, of the common longbowman, the common man-at-arms, saying, you will buy at great expense the deaths of all of our fellows here. So a very patriotic, rousing band of brothers type representation of bodies. If we need to die, then we shall die valiantly. And then the representation of the death by the end of the battle, where he talks about, this note doth tell me of 10,000 French that in the field lie slain, of princes in this number, and nobles bearing banners there lie dead, 126. Added to these of knights, esquires, and gallant gentlemen, 8,400, of which 500 were but yesterday dubbed knights. Brand new squires dubbing knights. So that in these 10,000 they have lost, there are but 1,600 mercenaries, and the rest are princes, barons, lords, knights, and squires, and gentlemen of blood and quality. The flower of French nobility who die, the majority, on the fields at Agincourt.
And more than half of them
being crushed and drowned underneath their horses as they try to make their way through the mire. It's this juxtaposition of the noble ideal of martial prowess and chivalry. Juxtaposed to this, we can jump back 12 years to Henry not as the 28-year-old leading campaigner, but the wounded teenager at Shrewsbury. And John Bradmore describes again, and then I cleansed the wound with a syringe full of wine, and then placed in new probes made of wads of flax soaked in a cleansing ointment. And
this made thus.
Take a small loaf of white bread, dissolve well in water, and sift through the cloth. Then take a sufficient quantity of flour and barley and honey, and simmer over a gentle heat until it thickens, and add sufficient turpentine oil, and the healing ointment is made. And from the second day I shortened the said wad, soaked in the aforesaid ointment every 2 days, and thus within 20 days the wound was perfectly well cleansed. And note that from the beginning right up to the end of my cure, I always anointed him on the neck, every day in the morning and evening with an ointment to soothe the muscles, and placed a hot plaster on top, on account of the fear of spasm, as Amanda mentioned, which was my greatest fear. And thus, thanks to God, he was perfectly cured. Contrast again with Prince Hal out onto the battlefield with the arrow still stuck in his face in the Shakespearean representation with the account of the physician. Thinking about how exactly can we relate to these wounded bodies, to the people who are treating them, to the methods of the wounding itself, and then the process by which we can determine how effective these methods are. These are a number of questions, largely still open-ended questions that we who are working in the history of medicine, the history of martial combat, historical martial arts are frequently left to consider. We don't have answers to all the questions just yet, but ideally you have a number of questions for us. And so we'd like to thank you very much for your attention. And offer a brief opportunity for question and answer. Anything that you might like to have. Amanda can also jump up here if you have specific questions for her or specific questions for me. That doesn't need to take very long because we'd also want to give you plenty of time to handle the artifacts from the Oakeshott collection. But in the meantime, does anybody have specific questions? Yeah. Yep.
So on the wounded now, some of those early physiological models showed like these very round orbs, like next to the joints and
Next
stuff.
to the calf.
Yeah.
And the very late one had one against the forearm and one against the calf.
Yeah.
That's not too.
Yep.
The early one had.
So I mean the axes and swords, those are pretty obvious, but what are the
Was that shot?
round orbs?
Shot.
Oh, okay. Firearms.
From firearms,
Like
for
little
example,
cannons.
the cannon you see behind you.
Gotcha.
Which is why his wrist is exploding. That'll do it.
In this one, you can see, like, is that a scorpion? Yeah, a lot of the woundsmen will have, like, scorpions and stuff on the bottom, too. So you can get wounded that way.
You can be poisoned, you can be toxic. You can also see there's a number of boils around the groin, this is also contemporaneous with the emergence of a brand new disease in the European context that really begins around army camps, known as the French disease. Today we call it syphilis.
Also, why surgeons' staffs went down a little bit, because they were the ones who were treating it for the most part, and people were like, this is not going away.
I believe the French called it the Italian disease.
And I think the Italians called it the German disease, and most of it is coming from.
That sounds right.
Yeah. But if you can guarantee anything, it's that violence and disease will follow armies. There's actually quite a bit we didn't get the chance to talk about, but among a number of the treatises produced by both male and female authors, and a lot of them sort of between the lay person and the university-educated surgeon, is the idea of regimens of health. A lot of them, beginning about the 13th, 14th century, are starting to write books saying, all right, if you're going out on campaign, you have to do certain things, starting with make sure you dig proper latrines downriver from the camp. If you need to be going out on campaign, make sure you are bringing surgeons of a variety of different skill sets along with you and pay them well so they don't desert. Tim, though, you had a question.
Well, you mentioned very early that it was 6 inches in, and I was just wondering, is that the same, are we still talking the same measurement of inch?
So Michael Livingstone has an article about this, and he has a section on that, and so roughly, yes, it's similar. Yeah, so he kind of goes through comparison. Obviously, inch comes from the English context that we use it in anyway, but it's really similar. Yeah, so you can, yep.
You mentioned earlier, like license
much more inclined to say, all right, let's hire everyone who claims any degree of medical expertise because we need enough people who can bandage, to set bones, to clean wounds, that we can fully pay for. But it depends also on the location. So for example, Hans von Gersdorf is an example of another militia doctor who does come in from an apprentice-based program, but he does have to go through the accreditation of saying, all right, I trained under this recognized physician who was accredited by the city. He was a surgeon at the city of Strasbourg, so about the same time as those of you who are familiar with Joachim Meyer's work on fencing from the early 16th century. Contemporaneous to that work of martial discussion is someone like Gersdorf saying, and this is what we do after you cut.
So to follow on to that, if you were a surgeon working in one city and you got licensed there and you wanted to move, what would end up happening? Would you just lose your licensure? Would people in the next city say, well, I'll be damned if someone from Chanhassen is going to operate on me? Is this the kind of thing that would happen? I mean, were they not able to move from city to city?
No, it was a very transferable skill set, and usually demonstrations of expertise are sufficient for most medical licensing boards, in the sense that a number of early modern, and really by the 16th century, you have a number of towns that are forming boards of public health.
Which are usually in response to epidemic disease more than anything else, but they have a mixture of professional physicians in the sense of university trained or guild-based physicians, and essentially well-respected members of the community, burghers who are trying to make determinations about public health. But I think Italy does have a few specific examples.
Yeah, in England actually, like around London has very protectionist. So the guilds oftentimes were really, it was very difficult to enter the guild, some of the guilds, if you were from outside of London area. So like there's a lot of, I've been reading some texts too for the guilds of the cutlers, who get really upset about other people from other parts of England sending their shitty knives down to London, and then they would come too, and then they wouldn't want to let them in the guild. And they would make an argument that it was about the quality of the product that they were making, and the surgeons would make an argument about the quality of their treatment, but obviously you have an incentive to keep them out, to reduce competition, to control the market area. So like London, some areas were really protectionist, and it was hard to be officially recognized, which is why, especially around London, you have, there were women who were recognized in the guilds, but you have lots of cases of like women practitioners and male practitioners who the guilds go after, or the College of Physicians will go after. I don't know, Italy, depending on where you're at, the moving could be really difficult. Italians, even today, tend to stay pretty close to home. They don't wander. And so you would have these really entrenched networks of families that would just control it. So if you weren't connected to that family through marriage or blood, it was really hard to get people who would want to be your clients.
And frequently, for at least the Italian example, you have more. Generally, you have a better steady wage if you're working in an Italian city-state than you are in other parts of Europe at the time. It's one of the earliest parts that invests in the idea of surgery as something of an ennobled aspect of medicine in the same way. So they take it a little bit more seriously.
The French surgeon that you talked about that went to the old lady, and what was the thing that he got from the old lady?
I don't remember if I included the text. It was so like when you ran out of burning oil, you used like honey wine. It was that kind of a mixture.
Okay.
That she would apply to particularly the burned areas from, and this was really common actually on the faces because guns didn't work so great. So it was really common for
Well, and so most of it is a mixture of treacle oil, honey, and liniments, and it would just be. And the funny thing is, it's the sort of thing that anyone could buy at any apothecary at the time, and yet you have this, and it wasn't mentioned, but Paret at this time is also quite young. He's, I think, 23 at the time. He has recently been promoted to the chief surgeon for the army of the King of France, as he's sieging the city of Turin. And he's sort of operating based on, okay, what do most of the people writing the popular books, like this guy Giovanni de Viga, who talks about the poisonous aspects of gun wounds, say to do? All right, let's try that. That doesn't seem to be working terribly well. Everyone's in pain, and now I'm out of oil, so what do I do? And it is just finding, I mean, the funny thing is he's finding the first apothecary he comes to. It could have been any woman apothecary around Turin who could have easily pointed him in the direction of, no, do this instead.
I was going to ask about the economics of surgeons as well. If you have this sort of male-female difference, were they charging different rates? Did they get different amounts for their services? And then is there a class aspect to that? If you don't make as much money or lower social class, you have to go to a female surgeon?
I think that could be part of it. It's interesting, we have better records of this in Italy, because oftentimes surgeons and like the trades that were connected to keeping the person of the royal person's body, taking care of it. So everything from like chamberlains to essentially surgeons were within, and this was, I think was in Milan, this whole network of families, and there were lots of women who were the surgeons for these royal people, because you trusted them enough to be close to your royal person. And so there's this connection between those, and those women paid just as the women, oftentimes the women chamberlains made as much as the men chamberlains. Like it was more of your proximity to the status of the person that you are, whose body you are taking care of, whether that be through because of injury or sickness, or to take out their chamber pot. And I'm pretty sure I included an example of this. There's one woman, we don't really have much of other than just, like, we know that she was a surgeon in, Guillaume de Lise in late 15th century France. Louis the 11th employed her as a surgeon, and so we have records in the accounts book of how much she was paid, and it was comparable. So it's certainly gender is going to be a part of it, but it's also depending upon probably the skill of your practice. Like there are several 16th and 17th century women physicians and surgeons who are in the London area that keep getting fined because they essentially just build this in. It's like malpractice insurance, probably how it works, because they're so successful and they're making a ton of money, and so they're like, fine, you just like bring me to court, I pay my fine, and I go back and I do my thing. And so they were very rich, so clearly they were doing a pretty good job. So a lot of it would depend on your results. If what you were doing worked, people would come to you.
There were a couple parts that mentioned using plaster. Is that what I think it is, or?
I suppose, what do you think it is?
Like plaster, like, molding type thing. Are they used for like bone setting, or what's the context?
Actually, more of it was used for the removal of foreign objects. For example, a lot of the authors we've mentioned talk about aeroplasters as being something, and this is funny because we presented at the Medieval Historical Congress at Leeds this last summer, a number of Oakeshott fellows, and I attended a number of medical recipe panels because it's fun. I like to try out 15th century toothpaste. And I got into a small argument with a woman who was very adamant about the best way to understand historical recipes is try them out. Yeah, I agree, that's great. Except she said, when it comes to aeroplasters, because that's just nonsense. And the idea is, all right, you cover a particular wounded area or an area with a foreign body, you let it harden enough that you can then pull out something that doesn't necessarily come out easily with a hand tool.
Filling the wound with plaster and then pull it out. It's like it pour on it again. Oh man. Stop. Right. And you need to get that right in there.
Dale and then Lane and then
Okay.
Some time to hang.
Okay. So this might be a little bit silly, but I noticed this came up a couple times in some of the passages that you quoted, Amanda. And then it just struck me, because it's something that I've noticed before as well, is this theme of the wounded warrior falling off their horse and then being treated. Is that just a dramatic trope, or is it symbolic of their ability to no longer fulfill the task of being a warrior, or is that like a metric by which you can actually judge whether or not someone should be treated? It's like, all right, go and try ride your horse.
Sit on your horse.
Yeah, if you can't sit on the horse, then I'm gonna take you and we'll treat you.
So when I was going to be a professor instead of a technical writer and project manager, I was proposing my next book project, which is about horses, and maybe someday I'm gonna write it. And one section I want to really focus on is this, not lots of aspects of horses, but this relationship between the weakness or the status of the writer and the horse itself. It's all in romances, it's all over the place. My favorite example is like in the Mort D'Arthur, Lancelot gets shot in the ass by an arrow on his horse and falls off, and then he like goes and gets patched up, and he tries to go and be in a tournament too soon, so he gets on his horse and he rips his wound back open, starts bleeding everywhere, and falls off his horse again. Ability to stay horsed. So certainly there must be a connection between reading that as a status, but it's like to study it more.
No, I'm just thinking there's a weird connection between that and a lot of like 14th century surgeons have this odd fascination with writing about treating anal fistula.
Oh yes.
And it's frequently, although I think inappropriately related to knights, as sort of the knights.
Yeah, they get hemorrhoids a lot.
Oh.
Wait.
Did that answer your question?
So my understanding is that the clergy or the church people were affected a lot during the plague, because they were taking care of a lot of people. But I didn't hear you guys talk about the role of the church at all. So I was kind of curious to know that as well.
So in 1215, an edict was passed from the church that essentially forbid clergy from being surgeons. Like they shouldn't come in contact with like blood and wounded bodies. In practice, they did plenty of times. In fact,
You're
like
allowed to be a physician.
you can be a physician but not a
Told the
surgeon.
surgeon what to do.
Right. But in practice, they did. Like wasn't it Theodoric?
Yeah.
Who was a friar of some sort? Yeah. And a surgeon. So there was definitely from that edict, there was like a sort of standing sort of you shouldn't be the surgeon, you should be treating directly if you're clergy or consecrated or whatever. They would often be physicians though, and so they would be there, and particularly in cases of disease, which that's an evidence. Other than like the surgeon would be there to treat like the buboes, the things that are on the surface, and the physician would be there to try to regulate what's going on humorally and in the environment to try and facilitate actual like return to health. So they would oftentimes work together, but much more common for clergy to be physicians than surgeons.
Did that apply to the nuns as well?
No, but women just weren't supposed to be doing it at all, but they did. And so then when they were like, oh, we need women, particularly like the nuns who are attached to the religious order hospitals to be taking care and doing this stuff, it would just be reframed as care. And so if you don't call them a surgeon, that they're still doing it, like, oh, they're care, they're providing care and succor for the weak and the needy. So you just change the words, but the practice is the same. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, didn't religious orders, except for the monks and such, wouldn't they have their own staff of medical people? Would that include a surgeon, or would, since these priories, what are they called? Monasteries, wouldn't they would be located near a community, and so would the surgeon live in the community, and if they needed him, would they call him in, or would they have somebody who could do it on the slide?
So my understanding is that it varied really dramatically from geographic area to geographic area and by order. So like in Italy, the larger monasteries, like we have lots of recipe books that come from there, and they will have like medical recipes. They would grow their own gardens to make their own medicines. They would treat themselves for the large part, and they would treat people around them.
Well, they would also have a large staff of live-in or adjacent live-in servants as well.
Yeah. But smaller ones, I'm sure, they would have to work
And it does vary quite a bit because you have even examples like the beginnings of the Knights of St. John during the Crusades that do have examples of surgeons sort of predating, and they are having to treat traumatic wounds on a frequent basis. And so it's hard to say that there's any singular overarching rule about who is unofficially doing a lot of this work. As Craig is making his way up here, we should also point out that for anyone who is interested more in any of the swords you're going to see here tonight, there are still copies of the facsimile work from our founder, Ewart Oakeshott, The Sword in Hand. We have an abundance of these, and if you're interested, please consider buying a copy to support the Oakeshott Institute and getting a great book on the history of swords.